there were a lot of reports on cannabis, and the last two ones are from the Netherlands and the UK, Canada, USA. And interestingly enough, there was a lot of debate about marijuana, and they all point more or less in the same direction: decriminalization and some legalization. And the issues debated were more or less similar. Is cannabis addictive? Is the stepping stone theory correct? But there was a kind of progressive atmosphere in the Western world, also in the Netherlands. And the two reports that I just on the left over there are seen as, let's say, the basis of our coffee shop system, and that's wrong, because at the moment they were published, our, let's say, tolerant approach was already more or less practiced, but not very well known. For example, one example to illustrate that. We had a Dutch Woodstock festival, the Holland Pop Festival in Rotterdam in June 1970, about 100,000 visitors. And beforehand the police said, what are we going to do with drug use and the sale and dealers? And they said, well, let's do nothing. We just have a police squad dressed as hippies, and they were walking around, and there were about, they estimated about 70% of the spectators were using drugs, but nothing happened. It was very peaceful. There were no health incidents, no violence. There was some drug dealing. Some people sold amphetamines, LSD, no opium, but a lot of cannabis, mostly cannabis, and nothing happened. And that, I think it was a very important realization that it didn't get a mess, and it was, let's say, quite helpful, because they thought if we are arresting these people, we can have riots, and we can't handle that anymore. So it was also kind of cautiousness, and kind of let's see, let's wait and see attitude. And I think that's also a characteristic of our drug policy. And there were debates in the Netherlands at that time. In the media, there were a lot of reports saying that cannabis is not that dangerous, not that addictive, and that we should legalize it or be less repressive. And I think that also had this influence on policymakers. But it raised some debate. The Ministry of Justice in the Netherlands thought it was not a bad idea, it was a great experiment. Whereas the Ministry of Health said, you're violating the UN conventions, and we have obligations to other states, and we have to uphold the law. Anyhow, this was, I think, an important experiment. They don't have a lot of experience, not a lot of knowledge. They studied a couple of reports from the US, and they said, well, it seems to be, it's not harmless, but there's a clear distinction between amphetamines, LSD, opium, and cannabis. Is it addictive? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's a kind of habit or a bad habit, but not something very seriously. Thirdly, stepping stone theory, and they said, well, it's that the labeling theories were very popular in the Netherlands in these years, and they said, if you have cannabis users and drug scenes that are mingled, then it's easier, then the stepping stone theory is correct. If it's a kind of peer pressure, if your friends use cannabis and LSD, then it's very likely that you're also going to try LSD. So that was also the idea to make a kind of distinction between cannabis on one hand and the other drugs on the other hand. Finally, the role of criminal justice. The Netherlands was almost a crime-free country in these years, I must say. We had the lowest incarceration rate in the Western world. It was a very peaceful country in a way, and there was not much enthusiasm to use criminal law for a health problem. And at the Ministry of Justice, they said, if our health colleagues can't convincingly tell us that it's an unacceptable risk, then we are not really willing to spend our capacity in law enforcement on cannabis users. But then something changed. Heroin. It was introduced in the summer of 1972. There was a rapid increase in consumption. It was organized crime. At first Chinese triad with Southeast Asian heroin. In the 80s followed by Turkish organized crime with heroin from Afghanistan. And it really changed our inner cities. There was a lot of street dealing, a lot of open drug scenes, a lot of drug debts, and you know, our idea of drug use really changed. And there was also, you know, I think that also contributed to the fact that we were not really interested anymore in cannabis, in the sense that it was so obvious that heroin had a much more negative effect on young people's lives than cannabis, that we also had a kind of, we should have kind of difference in policy, in legislation. And in the end, it was decided to revise our Opium Act, the drug law. I think it's almost quite similar to a number of US states. Up to 30 grams, that's an ounce in the US, more or less, of cannabis became a misdemeanor. Above 30 grams offense, and it was a package deal, a substantive increase of penalties for trade production of the harder drugs, the drugs with unacceptable risk, as we call it. So that's not very new, because it's, I mean, it's, we've seen it in many other countries, but there was not something else in the Netherlands. The idea not to legalize cannabis, but to, let's say, decriminalize it, was the feeling that, you know, they said we can't legalize it on our own. We're in the midst of Europe. Sorry, 5 minutes, I will speed up. And they expected that cannabis would be legalized within a couple of years. Other countries would soon follow, because they felt it was rather somewhat ridiculous to keep on, to continue with the repressive approach. So we use the expediency principle, and I think that's a key principle. It means that a public prosecutor can refrain from prosecution on the grounds of general interest. It's official definition, but basically it means priority setting. And they said cannabis for person who has the lowest priority, and that means they're not going to do anything about it. It's being tolerated. It's not legalized, but it's tolerated. And it's very helpful, because we also applied it for other, let's say, moral issues: euthanasia, abortion, prostitution. We all use this principle not to enforce. It's also kind of less wait and see attitude, because if you're uncertain about social changes, then sometimes it's good not to revise your laws or completely act, but you know, just wait and see what's going to happen. And I think that's also part of it. But then we haven't talked about coffee shops. The youngsters smoking cannabis, and that annoyed people, neighborhoods, and they just designed plates, and it's not allowed to smoke cannabis. And you know, that kind of things help, and it's kind of regulation without legalization. Thank you.
Politics, and I won't go over essentially what Marcel was talking about, except to say that you know, there was that moment. The real subject here is what made the policy window close. And there was obviously there was a great deal of criticism of international coffee shops. I remember vividly when President Mitterrand announced that he would not meet with the Dutch Premier because the Netherlands was a narco state, and not something that went by unnoticed by the Dutch public or politicians. And it was seen that the coffee shop system had, in a way, eroded the controls that were intended to be in place. Instead of being sort of small, sort of alternative styles, these were now real commercial businesses. Frankly, if I might comment here, as an American, big, you do not know big. But it was not what you had in mind. And there was always this concern about the sort of inconsistency, the front door, back door problem. It was legal to sell out the front door, but illegal to buy at the back door. And a growing concern about drug tourism. The French president might be calling it a narco state, but the French were happy to go there. and there was in general a sort of rising conservatism, social conservatism in the country. There was also growing concern about supply reduction, which I gather went with the sort of general concern about sort of law and order in the country. And the Ministry of Justice became more powerful in drug policy at the expense of the Ministry of Health, and national government became more involved relative to local governments. And at the same time, Marcel referred to the naivete on a number of fronts. Well, one of them was a sort of growing awareness that in fact cannabis use could create problems and could create dependency. There was in fact a very substantial increase in the number of persons in the Netherlands seeking treatment for cannabis-related problems in the 1990s. So there was a move towards increased control. The big coffee shops were to be closed so as to reduce the extent of nuisance and maintain public order. There was an experiment with the so-called weed pass, where you had to register in order to use that. As the potency, as the THC content rose, the move towards maybe reclassifying very strong marijuana as a hard drug, and the increasing visibility of organized crime in the cultivation and trafficking business led to more intense policing on that. At the same time, the development of more prevention and treatment. So what were the consequences of a stricter policy? Well, the number of coffee shops was reduced substantially. I think Tom is going to present actual data on that. And now there was more street dealing. No evidence that there was a reduction in the extent of marijuana cannabis use, but there was more open dealing on the streets. There was a concern that if you registered to be in the coffee shops, you were creating a record that could eventually be used against you. The street dealers sold less reliable cannabis and were more likely to be selling other drugs. So to that extent, that as you might predict, a stricter system led to an erosion of some of the gains that they received. And for someone interested in drug markets, I'm particularly intrigued by the fact that the Dutch were sufficiently tough about production that it was optimal to move some of the production over the border to Belgium, which of course had never formally liberalized its policies, but was much less concerned about cracking down on production. There was more sites being used because with the more intense enforcement, the returns to having more decentralized, smaller sites went up, and this sort of organized crime, I think, became more visible over this period. There's a sense that the current policies aren't working well. The effort to make it only for Dutch residents has been ended. And there are various mayors who are interested in exploring backdoor options, that is, finding ways in which to allow for supply strictly to licensed coffee shops. Utrecht already allows, or is just proposing social clubs, and Rotterdam and Tilburg actually talking about municipally controlled production for license. Great interest for this conference. The Dutch have a medical cannabis system. Just no particular attention to it, and indeed that may be part of the reason for its success. It hasn't been a subject for debate. Because cannabis is readily available anyway, there's not a concern about leakage from the medical market into the recreational market. The recreational market is there. There's no concern that it's being used, well, so conversely, it is in fact being used for medical purposes. There is a bureau that regulates this in the Ministry of Health. One licensed producer, 5 varieties. Would we be satisfied in this country with just 5 varieties? I suspect not, but anyway, 5 varieties. It's available in pharmacies on doctor's prescription. It really does look like medicine. I mean, it looks like a regular part of the pharmacopoeia. It's used by vaporizer or so. Well, it's not intended to be smoked, and health insurance covers it. So, while I think most of the attention goes to the coffee shops, it is fascinating that this, at the same time, you have seen the creation of exactly the kind of medical marijuana system that people aspire to here, but have been unable to reach. Now, Franz, are you there? Someone at the back. Okay, so I will at this stage hand over to Tom Blickman.
Look at 4 developments, or the current state of debate. It is one you could call the revolt of the mayors. We have seen that the policy was decentralized, and more the municipalities had a say over how coffee shops were run. Then we're going to look at what is happening in the courts. You can see that now there is some kind of the judges are getting a little bit impatient because there is no development in the policies. We're going to look at public opinion, how do the Dutch think about the system, and a little bit to the draft law proposal. And basically you can summarize it in the current state of the debate in either we abolish the coffee shop system or we go for regulation of the back door, like Peter already said. I'm first going to explain a little bit how it works, the coffee shop policy, and how that is implemented by the municipalities. The policy modifications Marcel was talking about in the mid-90s gave municipalities more say over what to do with the coffee shops. They even could decide that they didn't want a coffee shop in their municipality, or they could set extra rules. And what you could see is that the amount of coffee shops was going down. Also because some municipalities said, well, we don't want them anymore in our area, and we closed them down. However, we're going to look at the figures, and we can do that now. You can see here how that developed. It's even less now. I think there are now 582 coffee shops in 103 of the 403 municipalities. So about 25% of the Dutch municipalities have a coffee shop. However, most of the major towns have one. So if you would look at how many people have access in their municipality, I don't know the exact figure, but I would think that would be 75 or 80% for the users. The way it's run is called the local triangle. So you have the mayor, who in the Netherlands is not elected, is appointed by the government on recommendation of the city council. You have the chief prosecutor and the head of police, and they're basically responsible for the implementation, the inspection and enforcement of the coffee shop policy in their municipality. And they can set extra rules, like I said. One of the main rules that has been set in the past decade is a distance to schools or playgrounds of 250 meters. Other municipalities have 350 meters. Why, I don't know, but apparently some people walk more in one municipality than another. And you could also see that the coffee shops didn't really cover the whole market, and especially in municipalities without a coffee shop, there's still a substantial grey or black market operating. There. Decentralization of the policy led to a disparity between the local authorities and the national authorities, because much more of the responsibility went to the municipalities. And you could also see at that time that the government started to have more attention for the backdoor side and the involvement of organized crime. And you saw all these measures we already discussed. And you could also see a shift from a public health approach at the national level to a more law enforcement and security approach. And that had to do with also a changing more conservative political mood. And there was a revolt against the toleration policies, not only on coffee shop but also in other issues. I won't go through it all, but you can see it starts a little bit from France and Belgium. And that was the first sign of this disparity between the national and the local level. Meanwhile, the government went on and they had a task force, organized crime cultivation, who started to really pressure on illicit cultivation. And that again had a reaction, and mayors came together. Now we have 30 mayors of all major towns basically calling for a licensed growing and supply. MacCoun of the sky, that's a word, that doesn't work anymore. Like I said, it's the involvement of organized crime in production, which basically was also caused by stronger enforcement by the police. In the past, it used to be you had a lot of, let's say, idealistic cultivators who had a connection with a coffee shop, and basically, it was of course illegal, but it was not really organized crime. But yeah, those were the first ones to leave the business when the police started to enforce more and more the illicit cultivation, and they were the market slowly was taken over by more organized groups. They said, well, the toleration policy was successful for quite some time, but now it's become an obstacle to effectively tackle the problems, because the municipalities don't have a clear mandate of what to do. And over the years, also the debate in the Netherlands was reached an impasse between proponents and opponents of regulation, and the report said, well, we cannot longer wait till that debate is finished, and we need to act now. Also, again, the argument organized crime is undermining local municipalities. The analysis of that group is that the production of and trade in cannabis is now really causing considerable problems. And also more and more concerns about the quality of the cannabis, because it's now organized crime doesn't really have a public health approach towards cannabis. It's grow fast, pesticides and other stuff is now found in cannabis much more. organized crime also democratized in a way. People could go at a grocery shop and buy stuff, or they could even lend money to do so by groups who would also buy their harvest. And so more and more people became involved in this gray area of organized crime. So what they propose, we should end the toleration policy. We must create a clear set of policies for local government so that they know how they can handle the issue. Also, they reintroduced the public health approach in the debate. It was more and more a law enforcement and security debate of the past 10 years. And basically say, well, we are also worried about the bad quality and the possible harmful quality of cannabis, and that needs to be changed as well. The regulation is the best way to tackle organized crime. There's also some worries about some of the coffee shop owners and pro shop owners and their complicated position with links to organized crime. So there's also a kind of idea to sanitize the coffee shop sector again and have smaller coffee shops. And yeah, the regulators are increasingly sentencing these stashes, but they don't. So they do say that people are guilty, but they don't give them a penalty. You can see there is an increase of these kinds of cases. The other one is a verdict 2 years ago, nearly, where there were the old-style idealistic growers were also found guilty with no penalty for cultivation because they were reporting their income to the tax authorities. They didn't tap illegal electricity, and they basically supplied one of the allowed coffee shops. Yeah, well, then we stop over here. Let's go to the public opinion to finish it off. Here you can see 70% of the Dutch is in favor of regulating cannabis. You can see the different parties here, and these, the right column is the overall public, the overall result, and you can see per party. So if parties would take their voters seriously, there is an overwhelming majority in parliament to regulate tobacco. It's also interesting to see what the reasons were for these people, why they are in favor of regulating illicit cultivation, the public disorder, to fight organized crime basically, and also people see the contradictory elements of the policy, and that should end. Well, I think I have to finish over here. Just have to the debate. For the debate now, you can see the Netherlands is ready to regulate the cultivation, but there is a political stalemate why this doesn't happen. We see the court rulings are undermining the national policy, and yeah, it's becoming increasingly obvious that the next government has to make a decision. And there's also now the draft law proposal in Parliament, so they cannot avoid the debate, which used to be the case in the past 20 years. And you can also, what might influence a positive decision in terms of regulation, is that also in Europe and in America, policies are changing. Just to give one example, in Germany, there's in fact the same kind of discussion we have now in the Netherlands on pilot projects to experiment with a regulated supply chain. Thank you very much.
Hey, I'm MacCoun. I spent a lot of my early life in southern Michigan, so I thought I knew what the Dutch were like. In my youthful arrogance, I knew that the Dutch were stern, conservative, intolerant people. And then I remember my first backpacking trip to Amsterdam. I got off the central train station and realized, oh, well, that's how they ended up in Michigan. These are not the Dutch at all. The Dutch I know are not the Dutch at all. So I've been fascinated with the Dutch system for a long time, and Peter Reuter and I have been studying this for a long time. And in 2011, I had the most recent of a series of papers about what we can learn from the Dutch coffee shop system. And the paper was really set up as what the US can learn from this liberalized system, which was quite different than the form of, the kind of harsh prohibition that we had in the US. But I've titled my talk today, Relearning for the Dutch System, because we're really, just since 2011, a lot has changed in the world. I moved to Stanford, so I'm at a different university, but more importantly, the US is now on both sides of the Netherlands. We are both more conservative on marijuana policy and more liberal on marijuana policy in some important senses. The states that have legalized marijuana are going for a very different model than the Dutch model. They're going for a full retail model. And so I want to talk about that gives us a new opportunity to learn from the Dutch in really two directions. One is the opportunities for liberalization, but another is another way of legalizing that may have different consequences than the Colorado-style model that we're embarking on. So first, to set the stage, Peter Reuter and I in 1997 had a science article looking at what happened in the Netherlands when they legalized marijuana, and there are a lot of methodological problems with trying to characterize that early era. But it seems pretty clear that the initial decision to liberalize marijuana laws had no detectable effect on levels of use in the Netherlands. Curiously, by the 1980s, the Dutch, for a number of years, saw a very steep rise in marijuana that wasn't paralleled by any other countries we could find data for. And so we puzzled over that because this was quite a few years after the initial change of Dutch policy. And the explanation that we offered was commercialization, that in the early years there were very few coffee shops. In fact, my first trip to the Netherlands, there were very few coffee shops. It was the nightclubs like the Milk Bag, but suddenly you had very visible promotion of cannabis in coffee shops. I should say, by the way, in terms of promotion, this is a period where there was less restriction on advertising, I think, than there is now. So in some ways, cannabis was more visible then. But an important part of the Dutch policy is the argument that by separating the markets, you can break the link to hard drugs. And this is fascinating because Americans assume that the gateway is supposed to be some sort of inexorable psychopharmacological link that the use of marijuana encourages you to move on to hard drugs. The Dutch had a very different model. A Dutch sociologist, Herman Cohen, wrote papers arguing that the gateway or stepping stone was really created by contact with hard drug dealers. And so they wanted to separate the markets. And in my 2011 paper, it's very hard to rigorously test this, but here I found every European survey I could. And on the x-axis is the percentage of people who've ever used cannabis in various European surveys. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, the percentage who've used cocaine. The three triangles that are circled in red down the bottom are three Dutch surveys. And what I just want to show you here is that the Dutch appear to be less likely to move on to hard drugs than their neighbors. And I think this is at least suggestive that separating the markets actually was effective in the goal of discouraging hard drug use. The Dutch are very typical for Europe in terms of the relationship between availability and use. You'll notice that it's a little hard to see there, but the Dutch are in the middle of the distribution of perceived availability, which I find fascinating. There are, countries in Europe where youth think it's easier to get marijuana than the Netherlands. It's fewer than 5% of criminal justice referrals. So even in the absence of criminal justice referrals, we see that some cannabis users seek out treatment, or they're referred not by the police, but maybe by their employer, by their family members, and so on. At the time of my 2011 paper, the Dutch had a higher rate of marijuana treatment than their neighbors. And this seemed like a point of personal concern. And I want to come back to this point a little bit later, because newer data suggests that that's no longer true. In interpreting the Dutch experience, and here, I don't want to tell the Dutch how to run their affairs. My interest in this is what the US can learn for our own debate. And in terms of drawing lessons from the Netherlands, I think it's really important to understand that Dutch prices have stayed quite high. The Dutch prices have not fallen. And one of the things I want to mention is, at least there's strong theoretical reasons to believe that legalization should ultimately lead to lower prices, that the price of marijuana is artificially inflated by the need to compensate people for legal risk and by the difficulty of economies of scale of really large-scale production. And I tried to estimate Dutch prices compared to the US prices in two different ways, and they're basically comparable. And this is important because it's conceivable that what we'll see eventually, and I think we're already starting to see in Colorado and Washington, is that we are going to see steep price drops in the US states. And because people are price sensitive, that means we may see larger increases in consumption than the Dutch have seen. I had a couple slides summarizing their points, but in the interest of time, I'm going to, so I want to get through just a few points. One is, I recently tried to just look at what's happened with the treatment rate since 2011, and then interestingly, now the Dutch are no longer leading the pack in terms of treatment rates, and so perhaps the earlier figures were just anomaly, or perhaps this is in response to changes in policy. But the Dutch look actually pretty typical for Western Europe. For many years, potency was rising rapidly in the Netherlands before it was rising anywhere else. This is a recent paper by Niesink et al., and these are the distributions of random samples of cannabis in different years. And it's a lot of information here, but the important point is this increase in potency seems to have stabilized now and may even be declining. It's not clear whether it's because of changes in the toughness of policy or because customers are saying enough is enough. But it does seem to be stabilizing. So I want to leave you with two images of ways of regulating cannabis markets. And I think I just want to contrast what the Dutch have done to the tobacco and alcohol industry, because one of the things that's fascinating about the Dutch quasi-legalization creates this sort of Damocles that's sort of hanging over the heads of coffee shop owners. They can be shut down at any time. And so it makes them have to sort of really watch their behavior. And as we've seen, the Dutch have really enforced that. In the US, we've seen it's very difficult to regulate alcohol and tobacco industry. You have this phenomenon of regulatory capture. And it may be that the Dutch have stumbled upon a very interesting policy solution that allows liberalization while retaining this threat that keeps retailers from being too aggressive in marketing. And then finally, I think it's going to be interesting now that the US is no longer the bully trying to tell the Dutch what to do. We may see a change in conversation where U.S. really starts looking to the Dutch as our wise older brothers to help us understand what we're doing. And so I'm hoping the nature of the conversation will change. Thanks.